The Imperial Russian Navy and their Soviet successors, despite all their shortcomings, certainly had some very interesting and odd-looking ships and/or ideas. In this video, we're going to look at some strange and terrible Russian ships and/or designs. In the future, I hope to cover more general Russian and Soviet ships, but I don't have the sources. Anyway, let's get into the video. The first ships we have up are certainly weird and quite frankly not the best. The circular monitors Novgorod and Vice Admiral Popov. Following the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Crimean War, Russia was allowed only 6 800-ton corvettes in the Black Sea. The General Admiral of the Navy, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, was a forward-looking man and was understandably unhappy about the limitations placed on his navy in the Black Sea. In 1862, a series of designs were created to try to place sufficient armor and guns on a ship that small. Still, they found it quite difficult to fit everything they wanted and have good seakeeping qualities on a ship so small, and abandoned those ambitions. New studies came over the following year, but by early 1864, there was a change in development, as Stephen McLaughlin writes in his part in the Warships 2015 book. By early 1864, attention had switched to building monitors of the Uragan class. Because there was virtually no industrial base in southern Russia, it was assumed that the materials for the vessels would have to be manufactured at some distant place and transported to a shipyard where they would be assembled. This presented difficulties as the railway network in southern Russia was still undeveloped. However, Russia's vast inland waterways offered an alternative means for moving bulky materials. Captain Lieutenant A.I. Fedorov was sent to scout potential building sites. Having previously supervised the prefabrication of the monitors Koldun and Veshun in Belgium, he was well acquainted with the sort of process that would be needed to build similar ironclads for the Black Sea. The modern-day city of Votkinsk was chosen for the assembly of the monitors, and they could travel down the Don River and go into the Sea of Azov. They would have to stay in the Sea of Azov to not be counted in the restrictions put forth in the Treaty of Paris. However, after delays, it was decided to scrap the project altogether due to financial constraints and focus being placed on the Baltic. Leaders in the south of the country didn't want to give up the construction of new vessels due to the threat of new Ottoman and Austrian construction. Taking from McLaughlin again, as a result, a special conference was called to study the question of naval defenses in the Black Sea. In addition to conventional turret ships, the conference considered a proposal by Rear Admiral Popov for circular ships, an idea that the respected Scottish builder John Elder had also recently put forward at the Royal United Service Institution. Popov's circular ship was to mount the most powerful guns then available to the Russian Navy, either 11-inch rifles or 20-inch smoothbores, in fixed turrets, that is, an open-top barbette. He originally thought that 2 propellers would be sufficient to drive the ship. Whether it would be conventional monitors or the circular ones chosen for construction, there would be a lot of problems. For example, the major port of Sevastopol still lacked railway connections with the rest of the empire. Therefore, they called a second conference, and after discussions and experiments in St. Petersburg, it was decided that these circular monitors should be constructed. They are to be called Popovkas, a diminutive form of their originator's name. Popov and his assistants got to work right away, and were soon busy with a variety of circular ironclad designs. Different combinations of hull diameters and armaments were explored, including designs with barbettes or rotating turrets with 11-inch rifles or 20-inch smoothbores. The task of the designers was somewhat eased when the Naval Technical Committee increased the permittable draft to be 14 feet. On May 26, 1870, these plans were submitted to the General Admiral, who selected the largest Popovkas, a little over 6,000 tons, 151 feet in diameter, 12 feet 6 inches in draft, and armed with 4 20-inch smoothbores, protected by 21.7 inches of armor. The armament was altered to an 11-inch rifle by the Naval Technical Committee. It's always good to be on the same page. Colonel Mordovinko was chosen to oversee the detail of design work of these novel and interesting ships, and the naval attaché in London was soon buying machinery and tools necessary to equip the long-dormant construction workshops in Nikolaev. The hemming and hawing continued in the Russian Admiralty, as McLaughlin writes, However, apparently Admiral Kreby soon had second thoughts about building a single huge vessel that would cost 4.14 million rubles, more than had been specified earlier for the construction of 4 coastal defense ironclads originally proposed. On July 23, August 4th, 1870, he ordered the commander-in-chief of the port of St. Petersburg to work out a program for 10 smaller circular ironclads to be fabricated at St. Petersburg and Kronstadt and assembled at Nikolaev. The port's constructors started with a smaller hull, 80 feet in diameter, and with a displacement of 1,200 tons, each ship would be armed with 2 9-inch rifles and a barbette, while the armor would be 6 to 8 inches. To save money, this craft would be propelled by 4 70 NHP engines taken from existing gunboats. 32 such engines were available, so only 8 new ones would have to be built. The entire program would cost 9.5 million rubles and take 15 months to complete. Popov was compelled to reduce the size and cost of his brainchild. He and his team worked out 6 other variants, and in mid-October 1870, the Emperor approved a 96-foot diameter vessel. The ship would be armed with 2 11-inch guns, protected by 12 inches of armor, and propelled by 4 and later increased to 6 engines. The cost of construction, shipment to Nikolaev, and reassembly would be 1.94 million rubles per ship. The total cost for the planned ships was 8.5 million. As this was going on, events in Europe were overtaking the designs, as Russia was making moves to get the neutrality clause in the Black Sea rescinded, which was officially accepted in March 1871. However, the Russian government and economy could not support a large expansion in the Black Sea, and therefore work on the defense-oriented Popovkas continued. In the spring of 1871, the first of the Popovkas was laid down, with work going in 2 shifts to speed things up. Meanwhile, a smaller circular craft had been constructed, named Kambala, flatfish or flounder, and had successful trials, giving hope to the larger ones. Construction and shipment to Odessa first and then to Nikolaev were difficult, as problems with deliveries of parts from St. Petersburg to Nikolaev lacked everything, including tools, and even timber proved to be cheaper to buy Russian timber in England and have it sent to Nikolaev than to have domestic firms deliver it directly. In addition, the workers in Nikolaev were inexperienced. Complicating matters even more was the fact that Konstantin Nikolaevich was determined to attend the launch, which meant that the event had to be planned around him. By 1873, work was proceeding at a frantic pace, with 2,000 workmen bustling around the ship night and day. Even so, the launch date had to be postponed, and the ship finally took to the waters in June 1873. Christened Novgorod after one of the most ancient and prestigious Russian cities. She was the first large Russian ship launched with her machinery and armor already mounted. There were changes to the design, though, something we have become used to when discussing Russian shipbuilding. The most substantial ones were the addition of wood and copper sheeting, which increased the diameter by 5 feet. This, combined with other changes, bronze propellers in place of cast iron ones, increases to the number of false keels from 7 to 12, all of these were around 400 tons of additions, increasing the draft by 1 foot as well. The guns were finally mounted in September 1873, and she entered service the following year. The second ship, provisionally named Kiev, was going to see some changes, as Popov thought there would be necessary changes to the Popovkas. The Navy needed to keep up with the new British ironclads, like Devastation, increasing the armor and guns. 12-inch guns now, and these changes were approved by the Emperor in October 1873. A new name, Vice Admiral Popov, in honor of her inventor. The construction of this monitor was supposed to be completed by the autumn of 1875. According to McLaughlin, though, facilities at Nikolaev were still far from satisfactory, but as it was wintertime, the Ingul River was frozen, and a channel had to be cut through the ice to get the crane to the building yard, causing a month's delay. A factory in southern Russia at Yuzakov was contracted to supply some of the iron for the ship. Still, its products proved to be such inferior quality that it was necessary to transfer the order to the Revolovki works in Finland. Despite these and other problems, Vice Admiral Popov was ready for trials in June 1876, only a month behind schedule. That is, a newly revised schedule. Vice Admiral Popov had several improvements on Novgorod, including her engines, which gave Popov the hope that his design might be onto something, maybe more ocean-going. The impulse to scale the circular ironclad up into a full-fledged ocean-going battleship was due not only to Popov's ambitions, it was also backed by Konstantin Nikolaevich, who was always seeking new ways to improve Russia's naval position, especially if it could be done cheaply using new technologies. The circular ironclad seemed to offer just such a possibility. With its great carrying capacity and relatively small surface area, a ship with a round hull could carry the same heavy guns and armor as a much larger ironclad with a conventional hull. Spurred on by this project, in 1875, the Russian Naval Ministry requested and the British Admiralty granted permission for William Froude to carry out tests with models on several circular ships at Torquay, then the only towing tank in the world. Of which these trials didn't go great, with more power required to move the ship than a more conventional design. The Imperial yacht Levidia was similar in concept to the circular monitors, and although she was very steady even in rough seas, her shallow draft and flat bottom subjected her to severe slamming during a storm in the Bay of Biscay on her voyage from Britain to Sevastopol. By the time she had arrived at her destination, and soon enough with the death of Emperor Alexander II, and those things coupled together, the death for the enthusiasm for the circular monitors and their further construction followed. With the elevation of a new emperor and a new general admiral, Popov fell out of favor, and so did his ideas. Nevertheless, there were still circular ships left in service. Just so we're clear, here are the characteristics of the ships as completed. I'll leave this photo up on screen for a bit for you all to read. There were some changes to each of the ships. Popov's choice of a flat-bottomed circular hull was deliberate, even though he knew that it was less hydrodynamically efficient than Elder's convex-bottomed ships, which minimized frictional resistance because it allowed greater displacement on a shallow draft. The Popovkas had no keel, the hull instead being built on a series of radial frames tied together with circular stringers. Structurally, Vice Admiral Popov was a scaled-up version of Novgorod, with its flat bottom having a diameter of 96 feet as opposed to 76 feet in the smaller ship. In both ships, the sides curved upwards in the quadrant of a circle, while the bottom was carried up around the turn of the bilge, creating a side protection system of modest depth. Freeboard at the sides was minimal, 18 inches in both ships, and the hull was topped by a convex deck with the barbette in the exact center. An unarmored superstructure extended forward from the barbette to the bow in both ships. It housed the captain's cabin, the wardroom, and a portion of the crew's quarters. The rest of the crew was accommodated on the deck directly below the superstructure. More was added onto the superstructure of both ships in the coming years. There were concerns for their trials, as their seakeeping was suspect. On Novgorod's first voyage, the commander of the Black Sea Fleet ordered she be escorted by another ship. Such precautions proved excessive. Trials showed she had an easy roll even in rough weather. It rarely exceeded 7 to 8 degrees. On the other hand, the ships lost headway very quickly in rough weather. Novgorod was unable to make headway in force 8 weather, which is weather with winds of 34 to 40 knots. The shallow draft also made for problems in some sea conditions, since the ships sometimes pitched their propellers out of the water, greatly reducing their speed. The blunt hulls also made for very poor flow of water to the singular rudder, reducing its effectiveness, taking 40 to 45 minutes for the ships to steer a complete circle by rudder alone. And in heavy winds and waves, the ships were almost unsteerable. Steering by the engines became the norm for the ships, although it entailed a loss of speed. The guns also had their problems, as they damaged the surrounding superstructure when fired on trials, and their mountings were replaced. In this new carriage, reloading took no less than 14 minutes. During the Russo-Turkish War, Novgorod was fitted with more guns, and it was something that continued throughout their service, along with refits and upgrades to try to improve their abilities. New engines in Novgorod, but neither ship was sufficiently powered. Soon after the Popovkas entered service, they became a target of a great deal of criticism in the Russian newspapers, which under the liberal reign of Emperor Alexander II, experienced relatively mild censorship. As a result, there was an extended debate over the merits of the circular vessels, so extended that 2 substantial collections of newspaper articles were published in book form. This public controversy is the source of many criticisms that have been leveled against the Popovkas over the years. The central issue was the effect of the circular hulls on the steering of the ships. The other major change leveled against the ships was their alleged tendency to spin, rather than wander off course. Ironically, this may owe its origin to Edward Reed, even though he was a staunch defender of these ships. It is easy to imagine how rumors of Novgorod's giddy spinning could have been combined with the ship wandering off course on the Dnieper to produce stories of their crews being rendered prostrate due to dizziness as their ships were swept uncontrollably downriver. There are other stories of the ships firing and spinning in circles after, but they also had problems with their machinery being inadequate. The combination of the hull form and the trim by the head led to a beneficial effect, but one unlikely to be of much use in practical terms. The final analysis, the Popovkas seem to have been relatively effective coastal defense vessels. Certainly, their combination of armament and armor could have been carried by a conventional ship of much greater draft. Their faults, and they certainly had faults, were exaggerated by critics in Russia and abroad and have left as a legacy stories of uncontrollable ships designed by incompetent men. Both ships had somewhat uneventful careers and were eventually scrapped in the early 1900s. There were certainly some odd-looking vessels. Next up, we're going to discuss not necessarily a weird battleship, but certainly one that had an interesting fate. The former Italian dreadnought Giulio Cesare, and in Soviet service, the Novorossiysk. Following the signing of the armistice in September 1943, Italian ships, including Giulio Cesare, left Italy for internment in Allied ports, where some of Giulio Cesare's crew, resenting to having to turn their ship over to the British, en route to Malta, they effected what amounted to a mutiny, seizing control of the ship in order to sink her in deep water, relenting only after the captain solemnly pledged not to allow the British to take possession of the ship under any circumstance. This was only one of a few episodes of reaction to the armistice within the Regia Marina, either ashore or at sea. All of this to say, Giulio Cesare was not going to see service for the remainder of the war, having her crew reduced and the ship remaining at Malta for the foreseeable future, where unfortunately she was at the mercy of the weather, having damage done to her during her time there. There was hope in the Italian government that Cesare and some of the other battleships could be brought back into service following the war, with the government going as far to detail how this could be done. The problem was Joseph Stalin longed for a modern navy, including modern battleships, hoping to receive one of the Littorio class as reparations, as well as more ships. He was promised a portion of the Italian fleet in a prior meeting with the Western powers, but, spoiler alert, he wasn't going to get a modern battleship. Although he did receive the British Royal Sovereign temporarily, we will cover her terrible service with the Soviets at some point down the line. Anyway, Giulio Cesare eventually returned to Italy in June 1944, where, after handing over the firing mechanisms to British authorities, she laid in Taranto's Mar Piccolo in desperate need of repairs, at reduced readiness, and active, being this way up until January 1946, where the ship was placed in available status. This only lasted a year when she was placed back at reduced readiness, awaiting the fate reserved to her by the peace treaty. On February 10, 1947, Italy signed the peace treaty imposed on her by the victors in Paris, involving the loss of territory, material, and moral sacrifices, where Ermino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro in Italian battleships Conte di Cavour and Duilio classes 1911 to 1956 write, "The greatest bitterness came from the treatment of the Italian fleet, as if it were war booty to be divvied up amongst the victors. The battleships were divvied up, with the British and Americans receiving 2 of the Littorio class, and the Italians were allowed to keep the Duilios. With the Conte di Cavour sunk, it left the Giulio Cesare to be handed over to the Soviet Union. Like I mentioned before, the Soviets were promised a portion of the Italian fleet, totaling some 51,464 tons, including the Giulio Cesare, a light cruiser, 3 destroyers, 3 torpedo boats, 2 submarines, and 35 other vessels. The treaty was not exactly popular with the Italian people or navy. Again, quoting De Toro and Bagnesco, "The delivery of these ships was seen by Italian sailors, as well as by the greater part of the population, not only as unfair and humiliating, but also as a renewed and unequivocal sign of defeat, which co-belligerency had managed to erase from the memory of many. The delivery of the ships was going to be made because of the discipline of the officers and crew, avoiding the real danger of the possible dissolution of the Italian navy. It should be noted that some plans were foiled to sabotage Giulio Cesare and other ships before they were handed over to the Soviet Union. This theme of Italian anger is something that will be important later on, so keep it in the back of your mind." By the time Cesare was going to be transferred to the Soviet Navy, she had been inactive for the better part of 3 years, almost devoid of crew, at a very reduced state of readiness, and not in great condition. The treaty stipulated that the ships were to be ready for service, i.e. in operational condition, by September 15th, 1947, which for Cesare was not going to happen. This will become apparent shortly. After some negotiating, Moscow agreed in July 1948 that the ships could be handed over in their current condition. The Giulio Cesare and other ships promised to the Soviet Union were on their way with their stores full of everything the ships could need, making a stop at the Albanian port of Valona where the ships were going to be handed over. On February 6, 1949, the documents were finally signed, handing the battleship over to the Soviet Union. The Italian crew was treated rather harshly, quickly removing them from their post and keeping them under guard on the forecastle. The Soviets were very worried about the prospect of sabotage, something that might have happened to another Russian dreadnought, the Empress Maria, 42 years ago at that point. The Soviets searched the ship up and down, looking for any explosive devices, but they didn't find any. The ship assumed, although still provisionally, the name Novorossiysk, in honor of the city of that name on the Black Sea, which had resisted a prolonged German siege, arriving in Sevastopol on the 26th. The Soviet authorities began to complain almost immediately with the condition the ship was in, with Stephen McLaughlin and Soviet and Russian battleships reporting her condition with the armament, main machinery, hull structure, bulkheads below the waterline, armored deck all being satisfactory, while the bulkheads above the armored deck, watertight doors, and hatches were unsatisfactory. Things that were in poor condition were the piping, internal communication systems, auxiliary machinery, firefighting systems, and diesel generators, which were non-operational. Bagnesco and De Toro describe her having rust almost everywhere, and the light anti-aircraft guns being useless due to their poor condition. Italian sources report the Soviets who were in charge of the handover were mainly inspecting the ship to see if everything was there, and if there were any attempts to sabotage the ship, not the state the equipment was in. Maintenance was constantly carried out on the ship before her official entrance ceremony to the Black Sea Fleet on March 5, 1949, being given a cleaning and a fresh coat of gray paint. The ship was subject to propaganda as a great triumph for the Soviet Union, as it had acquired a battleship from a defeated fascist foe. Despite the fact that the ship was not modern and of a type that was largely outdated, it was nevertheless the largest ship in service with the Black Sea Fleet. Being such, she became the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, assuming the role of a training ship to get the sailors of the fleet ready, but a lot of her time in Soviet service was spent being refit. Between 1949 and 1955, she underwent 8 rounds of work, major and minor, including the complete overhaul of her machinery, meaning her boilers and turbines, along with replacing a lot of the auxiliary machinery and emergency diesel generators. Next, her main battery was planned to be changed with new Russian 305mm guns, but the ship was lost before this change could occur. The major armament modification was the replacement of the Italian 20mm guns with more modern Soviet anti-aircraft guns. New fire control systems, telephone systems, and other upgrades made the ship quite capable by the spring of 1955, even though she had been in service for nearly 40 years. The nearly 1,600 men and officers on her were finally getting the hand of the elderly battleship when in October 1955 she would finally meet her end. In the late afternoon of October 28, 1955, while returning from a 12-hour training cruise to the area of Cape Violent, the Novorossiysk, still flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, dropped her portside anchor off the Naval Hospital and then moored fore and aft buoys. These buoys were supposedly securely attached to the ship. A little while later in the evening, the captain of the battleship and his deputy went ashore for the night, replaced by the number 3. After dinner, 240 men of the crew were allowed to leave as they had leave, being replaced by some 200 naval cadets and civilian workers, bringing the total of those on board to about 1,350. This was the situation on board when, at 1:30 a.m., a violent explosion occurred, where McLaughlin writes, "At 01:30 hours the next morning, a tremendous explosion shook the ship. It occurred on the starboard side just forward of number 1 turret, in the vicinity of frames 35 through 40. As was later revealed, a hole about 150 meters squared had been opened up in the ship's underwater side. The explosion was so powerful that it blew upward through all the decks, making a hole 4 meters by 14 meters in the forecastle deck forward of the turret. The compartments between frames 23 and 50 were immediately flooded, and soon afterward, the forward magazines were also filled with water through a damaged bulkhead. The flooding very quickly extended aft to about frame 67, by which time they had taken on 3,500 tons of water. At 1:40 a.m., after the first few minutes of confusion, the commander-in-chief of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Alexandrovy Parkhomenko, from now on referred to as the CNC, was informed of the incident and reached the ship at 2 a.m. Despite using all the pumps that were still in working order, the ship was taking on a lot of water. The CNC was informed that only 1,200 tons of water was on board, but like McLaughlin wrote, it was closer to 3,500 tons, or 15% of the ship's normal displacement. The plan was for the ship to be towed, as it was losing buoyancy rapidly, to a place nearby so it could be safely beached. By 2:20, though, the forward portion of the forecastle deck was at sea level, and as a result, the 4 foot of the base of the stem post was already burying itself in the mud of the Black Sea, while damage control parties from other ships were arriving on scene to assist. On the deck, there were several hundred sailors who were not directly involved in the rescue operations, not of much use, and were moved around the deck slightly aft where the watertight doors were still holding. Before 3 a.m., attempts were being made to rapidly raise steam, which was possible because the machinery spaces were undamaged by the mysterious blast. At 3 a.m., the CNC assumed control over the rescue operations, which before were carried out by men of lesser rank. The CNC decided against evacuating some 800 sailors who were on deck and not assisting in the rescue operation. In his judgment, this was unnecessary and would lead to panic that was not needed in this already serious situation. The mud I mentioned before was greatly hindering the efforts of the tugs, and the most that they could do was haul her stern around and bring her closer to shore. The ship was listing more and more to port. At 3:30, it was 12 degrees, and by 4, it was 17 degrees, despite the fact that attempts to right the ship were occurring at that very moment, including trying to dam the waters at frames 50, 74, and 85. Even with these efforts, at 4:14, almost 3 hours after the explosion, with about 7,000 tons of water in the hull and a list of more than 20 degrees to port, the ship began to settle rapidly. This sudden rotation did not stop until the upper superstructure and masts began to settle in the mud. Although slowing, the rotation continued until 10 p.m. on October 29th, with a list to port of 172 degrees, or essentially upside down. Many of the crew were able to slip into the water as the ship went over, being picked up by numerous rescue vessels, while others had been caught up in the ship's superstructure. As for those who were stuck in air pockets in the upside-down ship, there was little hope, with only a few men being rescued from the overturned ship. The total losses were 609 or 608 dead, as the sources vary. To quote Bagnesco and De Toro again, "It was the greatest peacetime disaster in the history of the Russian Navy, and, as always is the case, was followed by a serious inquest to determine the causes and responsibilities. However, as we shall see, it also led to several absurd, if not ridiculous, conspiracy theories of political fantasy." The Novorossiysk was stricken from the list of Soviet ships on February 4th, 1956, and the following summer, the challenging work of recovery began. The wreck was floated with its keel uppermost in a series of flotation cylinders lashed to both sides by May 4th, 1957. Then the combination of ship and cylinders was towed to a small base with a suitable bottom, where the ship was righted and broken up. An investigation was started almost immediately following the disaster. The authorities in Moscow were keen on figuring out what just happened to their flagship in the Black Sea. The commission consisted of qualified naval personnel and was headed by an engineering corps general and a vice admiral. Once arriving in Sevastopol, the commission began examining hundreds of witnesses while frogmen and divers inspected the battleship's hull, assessing the damage and sounding the bottom all around the mooring in position 3. The work proceeded very quickly, and by the 17th of November 1955, the commission was able to present a preliminary report to the party's Central Committee. The conclusions of the document accepted and approved the fact that the damage to the Novorossiysk was not attributable to any malicious or accidental explosions, ammunition, fuel, or flammable materials internal to the ship, but rather an external underwater explosion by a charge equivalent to 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms of TNT. In other words, the most likely culprit was a German wartime mine laid before May 9, 1944, the date the Germans had evacuated Sevastopol, surprisingly remaining active and perhaps buried in the mud. At a glance, a mine seems rather unlikely, given the numerous minesweeping operations between the war and 1953, and according to the Commission, it was a German RHM bottom type. The mine was essentially a robust wooden box that was laid by a surface vessel containing an enhanced TNT charge, with the sensing element being a magnetic induction type powered by special batteries that had a maximum lifespan of 9 years. This mine was one of the most powerful mines found in the Bay of Sevastopol during the clearing operations, which led to the discovery of at least 19 large magnetic German mines, all of which were in the vicinity of the number 3 mooring where the Novorossiysk was. It is not known if any of the mines found later in 1956 and even later were still active. The mine that likely sunk Novorossiysk was an exception and not a rule, with both the battery and trigger mechanism still working. Also, given the fact that this specific mooring had been used 134 times by large warships, and thus with a large magnetic field. There were several hypotheses put forward, one of the most likely being there had been some blockage of the activation mechanism, which had occurred when the mine was laid, or caused by an accidental bumping on an anchor chain, which would have temporarily rendered the mine inactive and reactivated by later contact with a chain during the battleship's final mooring. The Soviet frogmen carried out a sounding on the seafloor and found, a week later after the explosion, the likely crater of the mine on the seafloor, and further testing showed the damage to the battleship was caused by an enhanced TNT charge. The report further detailed how rapidly the ship turned over and the serious loss of human life. There were going to be consequences with such a large disaster. Disciplinary measures were addressed to many high-ranking officers up to the CNC of the Soviet Navy, Admiral Kuznetsov, who was forced to leave his post because he was falsely charged with the Sevastopol tragedy and was accused of responsibility in connection to the technical and organizational shortcomings the disaster brought to light. Speaking of those technical shortcomings, the investigators decided that one of the factors contributing to her loss was a lack of substantial technical documentation in the damage control post. McLaughlin writes about the lack of documentation, corresponding more to a minesweeper than a battleship. Some primitive plans, 10 manometers, pressure gauges, an inclinometer, and wretched phones. Communication equipment was improved in subsequent refits, but adequate damage control documents, including stability curves, were never received from the Italians, although they had been requested. After the disaster, the Kremlin issued the news that the ship had been destroyed by internal fires and explosions, which remained the official story until the end of the Cold War. The unofficial cause, and more likely one, the German mine, was known in the West. However, the report did give us some other options to look at, including a torpedo fired by a submarine, attack by frogmen, or sabotage. These attacks were carried out by whom, you might ask? Well, the Italians, of course. Remember what I said earlier about keeping Italian anger in the back of your mind? Where, McLaughlin writes, several more or less exciting theories were advanced at the time of the ship's loss, and others have been added on since then. The most popular one in recent times has been the idea of a revenge attack by former members of Italy's underwater commandos led by Prince Borghese, and this theory has received wide publicity. Its chief proponent has been V.A. Karsavin, and his researchers have indeed revealed such an attack was possible, given security lapses in advance. Unless more convincing evidence is brought forward, there seems no reason to doubt that the ship was lost due to the explosion of German mines overlooked in post-war mine sweeps of the harbor. While Bagnesco and De Toro have this to say. In 1991, the year after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a volume appeared in Russia in which the first doubts were expressed regarding the entire Novorossiysk event. The mine theory was challenged, while at the same time an attack by frogmen, and Italian veterans of the Decima Mas no less, was presented as a more realistic possibility. Since that time, there's been a repetitive cycle of fanciful publications with a flood of theories, each less likely than its predecessor, all, however, coming from the same Italian sources, none of which provide any direct witnesses or documentary evidence to back them up. As fun as the Italian frogman theory is, it is unlikely, and the true cause of the disaster is probably a German wartime mine. Still, I will not say for sure, because it will most likely never be known for certain. Let me know what you all think about the disaster and the real cause of the explosion. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it will help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.